Needless to say, the first roster change period hasn't disappointed in regards to entertainment value, as multiple changes have been flying around like crazy, and I'm here to settle the score. I want to talk about a few done deals and some roster moves that are currently still somewhat in the works, but are for the most part somewhat confirmed, as we'll be having our roster watch for the Esports Dispatch continue to come out over the following days. But first things first, let's talk about 100% confirmed change up to this point is Dylan to Reciprocity. He will be filling the shoes of Australia's own Dens. Now, before I even want to discuss this move, I want to point out a tweet that was actually made from Dens a few days ago. He basically made, from what he said, a call to management after seeing their pool ahead of CWL Fort Worth, and he said, yeah, we're going to need some help. There's no more time to keep practicing. We need to be in our best form regarding what they have ahead. And despite everything going on in Call of Duty and the drama that relates to roster changes, I really respected that tweet from Dens. I went out and basically said, you know what, for him to realize and say, you know what, this is what's best for the team. This is what's best for us to succeed as an organization moving forward. That spoke volumes to me, right? That was, for me, the recognition rather of respect for an org, and that's a realization of what really team sports are. And the goal of the team is to succeed, like I said, in the best way possible, and I think he handled it with absolute class. And not many people can do that, right? Not many people can kind of set aside their ego and say, you know what, I know that I can do this. I know that I can make the team a better squad. And there's sometimes where you have to have that self-realization that, hey, maybe I'm not the best fit for this team. Maybe I could be useful in another way, or maybe I could find an opportunity on another roster where my abilities would be better fit. So for me, I think that was a very humble thing from Den, something that I definitely, and I think a lot of the community will recognize, because that does not happen often at all. That's for sure. So massive respect to Dens. Now, obviously, let's go back to Dylan, right? Because Dylan was Team Reciprocity's substitute, as now Dens, I'm imagining, will be moved to that role. But as of now, that is the only change that they will be making. Dylan does come from Team Sween, and his numbers pretty much for himself speak, right? They speak volumes to an extent, right? He looked very, very solid, and not only CWL Vegas, but as well at the PLQ for Team Sween, who unfortunately just fell short at the PLQ as well. So we could be talking possibly, if a few other maps go their way, Dylan already being in the Pro League, and this roster change wouldn't even be possible. His years so far, averages regarding Vegas and PLQ do follow. Hardpoint a 1.22, Search and Destroy a 1.15, and Control a 1.19, Respawn a 1.21, and overall he has a KD of a 1.16. And those are all obviously from our friends at codstats.gg. Now, one kicker for me when the original Reciprocity lineup was formed was, my question was, who are the Slayers, right? Who are going to be the Slayers for this team? Because I wasn't necessarily looking at Tommy. The players who I was looking at was probably Wiskin, probably Shawnee, based off the ending, kind of performance that they had, as well as Zed, right? Those are the three guys who I was looking at. I wasn't necessarily really looking at Dens too much. I didn't really know what to expect from Tommy, as he does have his moments, but I wasn't really 100% inclined of what this team was going to be able to do, especially when you looked across the board and said, oh my gosh, that 100T lineup looks pretty scary. Obviously, considering that we thought Kenny would be in the MVP mode that he was in World War II, and we were also looking across the stage at teams like Luminosity Gaming. That three is pretty scary, right, to a point. And so for them to kind of line up against them, I was thinking, all right, this team might need a little bit of help. But I think their Respawn talent hasn't been there, right? When we look at their averages or their overall map records at the end of the current state that we see them in the Pro League, after their 2 weeks that they played in Division A, they are currently 4-16 in respawns. So clearly, I think that they might need some help in that particular instance. Obviously, with Dens' 0.8 overall game modes, this team can't necessarily work with that at the moment. I think they desperately needed a little bit more pressure. And so I think for me, it wasn't necessarily an issue of Dens wasn't playing well enough. I think that we can see teams have a player go 0.8, but be kind of more of the baiter, or the guy who kind of entries in first, or a guy who can kind of play support. You can have a player on a team for once in Call of Duty history average around a 0.8 or like very seldom like a 0.9, like around that area, and still see success. It happens. But I think for this team, with the issues that they already had in slang, it just didn't help to have another guy who wasn't having a positive performance most of the time. But I like this change for Rec. I like the fact that they aren't making a total reboot or a total change-up. I think they are filling in a piece that is needed. And while we haven't seen Dylan play as of recently, considering all the GAs and the changes, I think he's going to come in and really make a solid impact. So, moving forward from Reciprocity, let's now talk about Enigma6, right? Because they also sound like they're going to be making a move this, I wouldn't say off-season, but during this roster change window as well. Longtime friend of Diabolic and of Coach Sender. It seems as if Chino will be making his way towards this team. And immediately this change makes sense for me. It does, right? I think E6 has always been a team that values things like teamwork and chemistry first. And that's something that TK was known for in the past. And sometimes, kind of hindered on. And I've definitely been someone who said, they definitely should be making roster changes just strictly based off chemistry. And I don't think that E6 is necessarily doing that here. But I think that's something that they value a lot more than other teams do. I think that they are heavily looking toward how is this player going to come in and impact our team in regards to relationships, in regards to chemistry first, and a lot more at least than other rosters do. So I think for me, this is a sign that they are going to be going after someone who is a solid player and someone who they know will immediately mesh, right? They know that he's going to mesh with the players. It's not a surprise like that. Obviously, new teammates of Frosty, and you talk about Kismet, etc. I don't really think it's going to be that big of a deal, but regardless, I think Chino often does play better when he's actually put in situations where he is comfortable. We go back to DT and Black Ops 3, probably the biggest hard carry of the entire Pro League. I mean, he was the one guy who was holding on for as long as he possibly could. We go back to Ghost, right, with Double Vanquish, right? They were making those runs. He was playing out of his mind during that time, and it happened to be with players that he had a lot of chemistry with, one of them being Cinder. And we also go back to the beginning of last title, World War II, with TK, before there were, roster changes or before there was even a thought in the mind that this team was having internal problems. They were playing well, and he was oftentimes considered to be possibly an MVP candidate. So for me, he's always been at his best when he knows his role and has players that he know theirs, if that makes sense. So obviously, one thing that we've seen so far from Chino this year, especially at the first event in Vegas, he shouldn't be running a SOG, right? Let's not throw an AR player a SOG in his hands. I just don't think that works very well. Obviously had a very, very slow event in regards to that. They lose a narrow game at the PLQ G2 did, which is obviously Chino's lineup, to even get possibly into the Pro League. So, I think this will be a good opportunity for Chino. Is he the right player? Is he the right fit? That remains to be seen. But I do have to give E6 credit here because I think they are looking toward the future and picking up an AR player. We talk about the meta possibly being changed. Is the Maddox, it's obviously toned down a little bit possibly. Do we see the ICR now become the main weapon? What happens with the SOG? Like we've obviously talked about the idea of the Swordfish kind of coming through, and we obviously look back to our Black Ops 3. Like I said, DT with Chino. You kind of get my point here. I think that they are looking potentially at possibly transitioning, depending on how the roles work, at maybe transitioning in general from an ICR maybe into a Maddox player so we can be a little bit more aggressive, because that's something that he has been good with over the years, especially when we look at Jetpack Call of Duties. He's very good at being kind of up in your face, fast-paced with those assault rifles like the BAL, like I said, back in AW. So I think that could be something that happens. I think this is a decision that makes sense as far as roles are considered, as far as the future is considered. And for me, in regards to roles and just overall teamwork, I think that E6 pretty much don't lose anything in regards to that, at least for now. But I did hear a few things, actually, from a few sources saying that Chino was not 100% definite, that they were looking out for players like Pharaoh from Hunter T and possibly Simp, actually, but nothing ended up coming from it in regards to price and availability. The buyout for Pharaoh's contract isn't something to look at and say, oh yeah, let's definitely add this guy to the team. So there were a few other options, but they do, I believe, settle on with Chino, at least as of this morning. Another discussion to cover. Evil Geniuses have done everything, I feel like, but announce a change, and possibly by the time that this segment goes live, they could have announced someone by then. But it looks like they are going to be loaning out Attach from FaZe Clan. Attach will be replacing Facento, and I hope this does signify a few role changes. Attach will come onto this team and most likely have a Maddox in his hands. I haven't had a whole lot of time to watch any of their gameplay. I know there's been a few times where they have been on stream. I know they've been practicing and kind of facing off in a few scrims, even a few online tournaments, etc. So, or at least qualifiers, etc. So I haven't really got a whole lot of time to check out their roles, but I'm hoping that this will allow Fellow to switch from Maddox, put that SOG back in his hands. Obviously, Facento was someone who was having some struggles, and that definitely kind of reflected their record, right? Because regarding EG, I don't know if this is necessarily just a one-player problem. I'm surprised that we actually aren't seeing more players get changed from this team. I really thought this team, considering the 1-6 record, might make a few change-ups, and the one victory that they do have is versus Team Reciprocity, which was a very odd win. I think we can all kind of look back at Division A, one of the last matches of the division, and say, okay, that one was a little bit strange. Reciprocity probably had in their minds a roster change as well, potentially. Regardless, they could easily be 0-7. Let's just say that. Let's just say how it really is. But this is what I expected from EG to a point, right? I came into the Pro League saying their spot in the power rankings, I think, is going to drop. I think it's going to drop tremendously. We saw inconsistencies from their best players at Vegas, at the PLQ. We saw Exotic skyrocket. Everyone else was kind of stale, especially Royalty. We saw Royalty go off at the PLQ. Exotic, one of the lowest players on the team. There were inconsistencies with who were the best players. And the SOC 2 SOG immediately made Facento, at least in my mind, a non-factor after the PLQ was over, right? He has a fantastic event. He goes from like what? I think like a 0.7, a 0.8 KD to like kind of being up in the 1.12 area. And the one thing that I was pointing out was, okay, hey, let's keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, let's keep in mind that if we go back to Infinite Warfare, there was a weapon at MLG Vegas that was really, really good, and it was called the OSA. After a few events go by, or after a few scrims go by, especially as far as the tournament series go by, people are realizing, okay, hey, this OSA is pretty good. We might even want to run 3, if not 4, possibly 5 OSAs on the map at once, and that was the weapon that Facento dominated with. He ends up becoming the MVP of that tournament, along with getting the win. Finishes off with a 1.2 KD. After the event's over, the OSA's gone. It's G8, as fast as light, and he finishes off with a 0.98 for the rest of the year. So we had already seen stuff like this happen. We've seen issues regarding roles relating back to Black Ops 3 with Elevate. He starts off as the main AR, then takes over as a support SMG. Like, that stuff has happened over time. So for me, the issue is that I don't think you can put Facento necessarily in a consistent role that you need to have numbers from. Like, there can be events, don't get me wrong, and I think Facento is a phenomenal player in regards to communication, in regards to his presence on a team, but for me, it was not really too much of a surprise that we do see this change happen, but I am interested to see attach on this team. I think he can come in and help, but unless we see a total turnaround, I don't know necessarily if his presence is going to be dramatic enough to make this team a real contender. It wouldn't surprise me if post-Fort Worth and cross-divisional play that we see another change possibly go through from the Evil Geniuses.